Welcome to Transformation Heroes by Fedia. Companies are the greatest platform of change, and we are looking in this series to dedicate to the professionals that are looking to make the biggest impact and want to grow their customer base. We'll be exploring topics like AI, LLM, security challenges, hiring, CRM, and much, much more. The series, Transformation Heroes, will be able to hopefully guide you through this as our expertise is focused on customer experience. We look forward to you joining us and thank you so much. Hello, and thanks for joining us on this very first episode of Transformation Heroes. Today, we're going to be looking at the top 7 security risks that are triggered using CX initiatives. And what we mean by that are, as CX professionals, we're using lots of different platforms, and those platforms might pose their own initial risks. So joining me today is François, the CEO of Fedia. Hello, François.
Hi, Carlos. Good to be here.
Good stuff. And today we're going to be looking at, as I mentioned, going into deeper detail. So let's kick off straight away and we can go through the first one. My first point is GDPR. GDPR is obviously a very important thing, especially for companies based in the EU or anyone that's doing work within inside the EU. So from your point of view, if you could just maybe explain, Francois, GDPR in your terms and what the sort of impact would be for.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's like it basically touches any company because even like most company in the US, even though Europe might not be their largest market, they still have some market share, right? So, and GDPR is very interesting because it was introduced like almost, it was in 2018. So it's been quite some time already, like it's been more than 6 years. But now we can see some really serious fines. When you look at Google, when you look at Apple, like all of these companies, I think there are real testimonial that the European Union is not kidding about their citizens' data security. Um, and it's interesting because when it comes to CX initiatives, as you mentioned, Carlos, we deal a lot every single day with a lot of like customer data a lot, because if we want to improve customer experiences, we need to understand who these customers are. We need to get data from them, and we need to analyze this data in many different tools. And when you think about the whole process of how you improve a company, like GDPR is just everywhere because you got pieces of data, lots of different tools from collecting to text analysis and so on. So I think that's one fold which we can explore on this topic. And there's another one about the respondents or the customer itself. When he's going to reply to a survey or like, give his review on Google, what happens to my data? And you can have like the two risks, like one
Yeah.
for the company, but also one for the end customer being like, okay, what happened next? Like what happened to my data?
Yeah.
And companies that do that very well, usually, like at least in Europe, they're going to be in a better shape. It is a competitive advantage.
Yeah, I would love to explore specifically more about the customer, the end user, as you explained at the beginning, because obviously that's number one priority, making sure that they have a good experience. So maybe if you could touch on the impact that we have around trust and brand
Yeah.
reputation.
Yeah, I think one of the key theme in the GDPR, if you were to read the text, is there is a like many different points, but like transparency and how it is a company's responsibility to actually, like be as clear as possible and be as transparent as possible. And if you look back and, like from a CX perspective, we all send surveys, for example. That's a very good example. Being very transparent about like, which data is going to be collected. If you want to be contacted, if you were to have a terrible experience, like consentment questions, having like GDPR footer notes, like these are things which are very straightforward to set up for a company. And that will make the GDPR compliance easier to handle. Again, and being transparent, like no one is going to complain about that. So that's probably a good start. And then there is also from a company perspective, when you are integrating a new platform, integrating a new tool, you do have some of the challenges about like, okay, which data is being collected, where does it end up? Because GDPR is very, I wouldn't say a pain in the ass, but there are like one of the key points is to make sure that the data stays in Europe, right? You don't want your customer data to end up in a data center in, like in China or in somewhere else. And so you want to make sure that it's very clear and transparent
Yeah,
whenever you work with a
great.
platform, like the chain of controllers and transformers of that data. And I'll give you one example with, for example, Google reviews.
Yeah.
Like if you have a platform that's going to do like text analysis on your Google reviews, like your customer have no idea where that data is going to end up. And for example, if you were to deal with text analysis, which is very common for CX professionals, like you need to understand what people say about you, and you need to, like analyze all of this data. Like you're going to end up with many different sub providers, and you want to make sure that you control all of them. You know exactly where the data is hosted, and that is not an easy piece of work.
No, and I mean, as an individual, that can feel almost overwhelming
Mm.
to piece to mind. Okay, well, I'm using X platform, but they're sending off information to another platform to get digested and analyzed. In terms of from an individual perspective, in order to stay, I think we can say diligent in the way that GDPR is being run. In order to stay diligent on maintaining customer data as it should be, do you have any advice of how
You
to,
mean from a CX professional point of view, or from the person
from a CX professional point
yeah.
of view, how to seek out a platform that can do that? What's the kind of things that we're looking for?
Well, I think there's one that is a contractual piece, which might sound a bit boring, but like doing what we call DPA, data privacy agreements, which basically is going to outline exactly which providers are going to be used. And for example, if you take again like a CX analysis platform, like there's a lot of third parties, and you want to make sure that these are mapped and you know exactly which data is going to end up where. And then there's a second piece which we don't see that often, but like we believe makes lots of sense, is encrypting personal data as well, which means if there were to be a data leak, a data issue with a provider or a sub-provider, well, your customer data, or at least the one you need to improve your customers' experiences and, like improve your product and services. So it could be an age group, it could be a gender. Like you want to make sure that this personal data is actually treated differently than, like your product data or whatever, like something that is less, um, not to say controversial, but I would say that has more value.
Yeah, and
So
I
I think these are two, like pretty straightforward one to set up, and which actually makes a lot of sense in 2024, right?
absolutely. And I think that, that's a really nice transition into a potential second risk, which is dealing with personal data inside, for example,
Yeah.
a survey. So I know you mentioned obviously encrypting. It'd be interesting to understand a little bit more about that process from your point of view, um, how secure information can be passed from one to the other.
Yeah, that one is very close, like again, if we probably there are just very few people in the organization that have this problem. But again, like if you want to improve, you need to listen. If you need to listen, you need to get a way to listen. And most companies today, they're going to use surveys. And what's interesting is sometimes like you're going to need to forward information to the survey to make sure that the data is actually actionable or the insights are actionable. And when you do this, like we see a lot of companies that actually send that through the URL, and it's going to say, like your survey URL, and then you're going to see, and customer name equal Jack, and, gender equal male, and birth dates equal, like, and you got all of this personal information that is just like sent out in the open. And, like this is it might sound like a little risk, but actually when you look at it and you see like how many companies are still doing this, like I think it's something to be careful with, because again, as CX professionals, like you're going to send a lot of surveys, and making sure that like you are not blindfolded by technical restrictions sounds like a good idea to respect your customers' privacy.
Absolutely, and it's something that can be easily missed. There's
Yeah.
an assumption that the data is being secure, but it's only when you go and check out the surveys that you're receiving over email and you're like, oh, actually, I can see my name embedded inside the URL.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's a really, really important point. So from your point of view, making sure that whatever the platform you're using, for the surveys, it's encrypting that data.
Yeah, you can use unique. Yeah, you can either encrypt the data, or you can, which might be complex and more expensive. But there's another way, which at least at Figure we do lots, which is using a unique idea and then enriching later on. So, for example, when you get someone's feedback, you don't need to get all the information directly in the survey. You can get, for example, just a Salesforce idea, or any CRM idea, and then whenever that feedback is inside the platform, then you're going to enrich it. And this process, which might sound simple, is actually very important if you want to respect, like your customers' data, because you're not sending it in the open. Because again, like if you think at like how many mails, like like your mail providers, like there are a lot of them that have been hacked in the past. And usually when you're, as a customer, your account is compromised, like your email is going to be compromised. And if your email is going to be compromised, like again, like basically you have lots of data in there, and the less you have, the better. And that's also something, it's not only the GDPR, but like most security regulations are going to be careful with.
Okay. I'd like to touch a little bit more on Google reviews and the review platform kind of experience, because I know lots of companies are obviously now connected to Google reviews. We're getting hundreds of thousands of reviews come through on a monthly basis. That's a lot of text to analyze. And, traditionally pre-ChatGPT era, that was all done manually. Now we have the blessings of large language models being able to do that, or a big part of that for us. But obviously that does pose a risk in the sense that we're now moving our data across to other third-party platforms. So from your perspective, it'd be great just to understand a little bit of how that relationship is when it comes to CX intelligence platform talking to a large language model.
Yeah. Again, like if you think it from a like, okay, how do I improve my product and services in my company, and how do I have larger impacts? Like LLMs are for sure a game changer, because they let you see things that you would not see before, and that let you do manual work at scale. And a couple of examples can be like drawing action plan, like doing text analysis much better, because then you can have topics which are very, very close to your business. So this is for sure very valuable from a CX perspective. However, there are a couple of risks. One of them is you don't want to send all your customer feedback in ChatGPT. That's the first one. And by the way, in any other LLM, simply because like some of this data can be used for training. And if you think about like your overall like customer feedback, whether it's like tickets data, survey data, like review data, like this is, as a company, this is your IP, like this is your intellectual property. And it's very important because it's very competitive, because like inside this corpus of data, like this text, you're going to find what doesn't work, the idea for you to improve, like some ideas for innovation, like what makes your company better. And you don't want that to end up in another company's data sets, or at least training data. So you want to be very, very careful with this. And there are a couple of ways of doing this. First one, I would say, is making sure that when you work with a platform, today's platform, they're all going to have a deal with a LLM. You want to make sure they have the proper, like data privacy agreement in place, and you know exactly where the data is. And inside your contract, there's a clause that says, "Do not use my data for training." And I think you want to be careful with that, because otherwise you're going to end up with your customers, like data, and your company's data, because it's feedback at the end of the day, mixed with your competitors' ones, and then all put together to give you some, like some models, which first of all is going to be outdated over time, but also, like it's basically your own intellectual property that you're giving to someone else. And you definitely want to be careful with this. And the first one is just contractual. And then there's another one, which is, I would say, like taking it to the next level, is making sure that when you work with a platform that's going to run on the LLM to give you value, one way of doing it is to self-host the LLM inside the software environment, and making sure that no data whatsoever is going to exit, like it's not going out of the provider, and therefore you cut the chain. And you say like, okay, when we talk about LLM, it goes into a control environment. It doesn't go into, like OpenAI servers somewhere in the US. It stays inside, for example, if you're based in Sweden, it stays in Sweden. And I think like having control and visibility on this is very, very important. And that's something that's probably we want to be careful with in the future.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point of how we store that information when it comes to, obviously, there's the training aspect, and that's a very important part of having large language models growing and being better for us. But do we want to sacrifice our IP, as you mentioned, our intellectual property, by giving that information across and then almost homogenizing the market? Because if we're a large hotel chain and we're giving all the information about our problems and our issues, suddenly all our competitors can now benchmark
Yeah,
against that issues that
yeah.
we face. So
It's a very interesting because it's happening like now, like it's not a fantasy, it's not a what if in 10 years, it's really happening now. And again, like just making sure that you control the environment, that you have enterprise deals or the companies that you work with, even if it's just as simple as a text analysis platform,
mm,
like you just want to be careful that they're not using your data in a way that you don't want. And also another one that is more technical, I won't go too much into in the details, but there is when you talk about LLM, there is a field, if I would say, which is called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation, which basically lets you use your data without uh, training the model on your data, and it makes the insights very relevant without necessarily, like taking the data to train the model to get results, and also the very good, or from a CX perspective, like a key advantage is you have no training delay because you don't train on your data, and therefore you can use like today's data to get some insights, and that's very valuable because when you think about like improvement plans, like you don't want to get your model run every single month, and then hey, I have the monthly insight. You want that to be run more on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, and also it's a lot cheaper.
thank you. Yeah, that's
The protocols.
Okay, going a little bit more in a different direction, it'd be interesting to understand where we are with cybersecurity, because obviously, with the dawn of AI as we have it, that does pose greater risks. We are seeing more sophisticated cybersecurity attacks happening to not just large-scale organizations, but also small,
Yeah.
medium, as well as obviously the individual. So, from your point of view, if a CX professional is asking for information or wanting to understand minimum level compliancy, are there any certificates? Are there any particular areas?
Yeah, there are a lot. And I think what's interesting is when you look at, whenever we start working with the companies, usually when you want to set up a CRM or you want to set up an ERP system, like you're going to have a lot of security checks. Usually when you say, okay, I'm going to listen to my customer and I'm going to analyze this data, sometimes, or most times, like it's going to go under the radar. And one thing you want to do as a CX professional to make sure you do things seriously and you add value on the long term for your business is you want to go through the regular, like security checks. And the security team, the IT team, they have cybersecurity grids, which are very important because they let you qualify when you work with a partner, like what's the level and the maturity. And then there's another one which is very, I think, interesting is making sure that you choose vendors. And it also works for us, like when we work with, as a software editor, when we work with other providers, making sure that there is a chain of certification. So for example, Figure, we certified ISO 27001. Like we want to make sure that we only work with providers which are certified ISO 27001, because then when a company asks us, like we're going to send you our valuable IP, meaning our review data, our customer feedback data, our ticket data, like what's broken, what's not broken, we're going to receive that data and we're going to analyze it for them. Well, we want to make sure it's treated seriously. And therefore, the ISO 27001 certification is a very good proof of that. You have SOC 2, which is more in the US, but that's also very good as well. And there is a big difference between being compliant and certified, and you want to, like you want to go for the certified version. Like we used to be compliant ISO 27001, and everyone can be compliant. There is no check, so basically, like it means everything and nothing. Whereas like being certified, you actually have a firm that's going to evaluate a lot of criteria, and it's also an expensive program to run internally to be compliant, to be certified. Sorry. Um, and therefore, you want to make sure that, like if you work with people which are certified, that means they've invested quite a lot of resources to have the proper, like all the different security tools, the different security alerts, and so on.
That's very interesting because I didn't realize myself that there's a difference between compliant and certified. For me, compliant means I've ticked all the boxes, you know?
Yeah, but everyone can be compliant with
Yeah.
everything. That's a good, like you can always put the logo. And that's why, like if you talk to your IT team or to your cybersecurity team, they're not going to say, are you ISO 27001
Compliant.
compliant? They're going to ask you for the certificate, when the certificate was issued, and when does it expire? Because also the good thing with these programs is they expire on a yearly basis.
Mm.
So you have to renew them every single time, which is rather good news because like, that means you can't do it once and then like let it go. You have to on a quarterly basis, on a monthly basis, you have to follow up the actions. You got to make sure the actions plan in terms of security are set up. And you also, what we've discussed with GDPR as well, like making sure you encrypt personal data, making sure you have database backups for your feedback, like all of this is something that's being checked as part of the audit. So for sure, it is very valuable.
Yeah. And there's a lot of trust that then can be given to
Yeah.
that platform that you're using.
Yeah. It doesn't mean you're never going to have any issue. It
Mhm.
just means that if there is an issue, you're going to be more prepared.
Okay. Speaking of trust, obviously, when you're working through a big CX program, you might be working with ticketing data, you might be working with, analysis, and so you might have lots of different employees going through that customer data. Do you have any tips of why or how we can restrict customer data to be given to the right people at the right time, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, because it's interesting. Like what we see a lot in with our our clients is when you look at the feedback, which sounds like it's very innocent. Like sometimes you're just going to have people that yell at you, sometimes that are very satisfied, and sometimes you end up with like credit card numbers. Sometimes you end up with you end up with a lot of data that is like because most of it is just I mean not most of it, but if you look at a support ticket, if you look at a like after an NPS question, like an open text, you're going to end up with people which are going to send you like a lot of information, which can be very, um, uh, like personal
Yeah.
as a startup, but also you have to deal with it carefully. And you don't want everyone to see everything. Um, and one way to do this is to have different roles, of course, making sure that not everyone sees the same thing, but also that it's, like when there is data that is very critical, that it can be automatically replaced. So I'll give you an example where you can automatically replace like large numbers, which usually are account numbers, because if you can already do the link with your CRM, like you don't need your customer to send it to you like through a text, like you already have this information and it's already treated, like it's already encrypted, it's already treated safely. So you want to make sure that you, like whenever you have this piece of information, it's automatically replaced because then it's a lot more safe and it makes your compliance life easier. And like you're not going to have any surprises in the future. So there's really like an organizational answer, which is making sure you have roles, you have teams, and people have access to the feedback they need to see. And then there is another one, which is just like from a technical standpoint, like making sure that when you are going to receive that information, it is going to be treated differently. And whether that's, again, CRM data, sure, but when it's in text, it's a little bit harder. But thanks to, like natural language processing and NLP right now, today you can deal with them like fairly easily.
Cool. I just got a Slack notification on my phone and it was vibrating like mad. So I don't think you had that.
No, no problem.
Good, good. Okay, well, touching on the kind of non-authorized employees potentially going in, I don't know if we could maybe touch on some of the roles because you mentioned there are different roles. What's the kind of standardized roles that you might have at a platform?
Well, I think as most platform, like you want the CX team or the people that are taking the initiatives of, like running the improvements, not on a, like on the operational basis, but more on the, like running the whole program to see pretty much everything. And then you want to open as many accounts as possible to get people that can actually drive change on the ground. And you want to have different teams. And that's kind of like the beauty with CX, right? It's just not about like customer support. Is you touch on marketing, you touch on product, you touch on sales, like you touch on many different departments. And in order for you to increase the level of impact that you have, you want to make sure that you're not, like leading the battle by yourself with your flag. You want to bring as many people as possible with you. And one way of doing this is, like giving access. And if you have, like, for example, viewer roles, they will let you view, for example, if I'm in marketing and I want to see just, what happened in my e-commerce journey, like as long as you can do this, but they don't necessarily have to see, for example, what happened in the stores, because it's less interesting for them, and also they cannot really action it because they're not in charge of that. Like you want to split this, but on your side, as a person in charge, you still want to have a global view on everything.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. And I know, obviously, it's a lot of data to go through. Obviously, we've been leaning a lot on LLMs recently, but traditionally, the way that CX professionals work with a lot of this data is through consultants. So I wondered if we could maybe touch on the consultant process and how, obviously, there's a level of security that's involved in making sure that the information that you have is secure. How does that traditionally work with a consultant in order to, reduce the risk of them running to the next door and talk to
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's something that's massively changing in our world today. Is like most companies like 20 years ago, they were not really doing it themselves, like understanding the clients and so on. They were like calling a firm, being like, hey, we need to run a yearly survey. You're going to call X customers, and we want to report every single year. Obviously, it no longer works. And
And why do you think it doesn't work anymore?
because it doesn't fit today's space, first of all. And then, like 20 years ago, we did not have CRMs. So basically, like right now, you can have a lot more intelligence out of your, like customer feedback, customer experience data, simply because you can correlate it with a lot of different other sources. And you can do what one person or even a firm of consultants could never do, simply because you can, like you can run thousands and thousands of, like correlation until you find exactly what's not working. And you can backtrace it to understand exactly the customer profile you need to work on if you want to, for example, improve your NPS and so on. And these things, they were not really possible until you have like a way to do cognitive at scale, which is LLMs, and then a way of getting your CRM data, or at least your operational data, if you want to talk about ERP and other systems, that you can use as a CX professional, and where it's not that expensive, And if you were to look, again, like 5 or 10 years ago, like that would be very, very, very expensive. And the only companies that could do this would be, like massive, like S&P, like 500, like these huge companies, they had the power to do this. Where right now, like any 100+ company can actually be very good at customer intelligence, understanding exactly what's not working, without spending
as well, right?
What?
Utilizing the data, because traditionally so many of the departments would take ownership of their data, which makes sense, but then it would get lost in a folder somewhere. And
But I think that's also what's interesting, because with the kind of like the NPS revolution, like what happened in the last 20 years is most companies realize that if you look at, it's very interesting, if you look at most public companies, like the one that always overperform are the one that have like a very strong NPS. There's a lot of, I don't have the data on top of my mind, but if you just Google it, and maybe you can put that in the comments, like there is a book which is called Good to Great, which explains, like why some companies overperform the market. And the NPS founder, he wrote a book like in 2021, I believe, and he explained like how the book was wrong about like why company overperforms on the long run. And he's making a case basically to say like every company basically that has a massive NPS, like above 60, 70, like they're going to deliver amazing investor value over time. And again, like that's something that was, like that's very clear right now. Like I think no CEO would say, yeah, let's not invest in CX. Whereas like 20 years ago, I think it would have been a lot different. And also there's a change of mindsets in the, like in the customers, in the consumers, which do value a lot more experience. And again, like most famous example would be like Tesla, Amazon, like Apple, like these guys, they have the best NPS, and that's also why they are so valuable and so good.
Yeah, or conversely, they're so valuable and that's why they have good NPS. There is there's a lot of
Yeah, but that's because they invest also massively, right?
Yes.
And it's interesting because in the book you also talk. I think we could make another show on this.
Yes.
It talks about like the experience inside an Apple store, or it talks about like when you deliver something, when you get a delivery from Amazon, or it's the wrong product and you want to say, okay, I want a refund, like it's the best experience you can ever get.
Mm.
And then obviously that's something that is very clear right now, but it's very hard to make it happen from an operational standpoint and make money on top of that.
Yeah.
And the companies that do these bets, I think it's doable now for most companies. Was like 20 years ago. Again, like you didn't have the budgets, nor the data, nor the human power to actually do that.
Okay, so from your perspective, from now to 20 years ago, the biggest difference is consultants were the traditional ones, and now platforms are able to do the same at a cheaper rate with less manpower potentially. Is there any
Yeah,
other?
and a lot more value as well.
Yeah.
But the main, I think, also what also makes it possible is because like most companies, again, over 100 people, like they've invested millions into their CRM, so they have like a lot of structured data, which they did not have 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And this is kind of like the beauty of it is now that you've made this investment, like you can massively improve your pace of improvements, your pace of transformation. And that's also why I think we call this podcast like Transformation Heroes, because people that do realize this inside this big company, which sometimes are pretty old, like you can make changes now that you couldn't make before. And I think that's very interesting. And if you look back to the, like consultant discussion, like I think what's interesting as well is when you talk about like cybersecurity or security risk in CX initiatives, like usually it was like, hey, like it's not so important. Like this data is not so important, so we're going to give it to someone else. But I think like right now, what you don't have with consultants is they have no certification whatsoever. Like if you are a software, like if something goes wrong, if there's a security leak, or even your our computers, like we have many security tools, which if you were to be a 10 people CX consultant, like you would not have this, and yet you would have like access to pretty much all the information of the company.
Yeah.
And that's an obvious one. But then the second one, which is also I think pretty interesting as well, is that idea that like most of the big consultancy firms, they work for your competitors as well.
True.
And a database is a lot more secure than like a human mind. I would argue. Again, that's a discussion, but that's maybe not for today's episode.
A
But
whole conversation on that, I think. Absolutely. Okay, so to wrap up, we've gone through a lot of security risks. We've gone through all the types of threats that a CX professional might face, and how a platform can instill a level of trust and a level of transparency. What I'd love to understand at this point is if a risk were to happen, and a breach were to happen to some extent, what's the kind of steps that are put in place? Because we never know. Like even if we do all our best, there's always a chance something happens.
yeah, and kind of like what really like is not that straightforward with this is it can be like again if you work with a text analysis tool, maybe the problem is not them, but they have a security risk with the database provider. And if the database provider is not ready and the tool is not ready and so on, like you can have a chain which at the end of the day is going to impact you. And that's why, again, like certification is very important because I'll give you the ISO 27001, which is, for those who don't know, it's the certification that actually is in charge, is used in most software to guarantee like information security. And you got a lot of ISO certification. The most famous one for CS is the ISO 9001. For software, it's 27001. And what's interesting is you have something which we call a recovery plan, which means and you have a disaster plan as well. But basically, the point is if something were to go wrong, like you do have a plan, and this plan is actually, like you do draws every year to make sure that when something goes wrong, like your team will be ready. You know exactly who to contact. You know exactly what to do, and you also have like regulation requirements from that. So, for example, with GDPR, like you have to, and in the US, I think it's exactly the same. Is you have to let the regulator know that you had a data breach, and even if it's not you and it's you, like, but you've been aware of this, like you have a minimum, you have a certain amount of time to actually let the regulator know that like hey, we made a mistake, our customers' data is out. And that's why like encryption also makes a lot of sense, because then again, if it's just feedback, but you cannot really link it with any personal data, like it sucks, but it's not that terrible. Was like if you was to be like all your customers' phone numbers, email address, like those birth date and so on, like that's terrible.
Okay. So if you were to sum up the things to look out for a platform in order to minimize the risks of security, from my perspective, it's making sure that they are ISO 27001 certified, making sure that you have a strong level of trust between the platform and yourself, and that the platform is transparent. So you know that if there were something to happen, that they would communicate that as soon as possible and as effectively as possible. Is there anything else that you might?
But I think, yeah, I agree, Carlos. But I think from if we take a step back from the transformation hero point of view, like if I were to transform the company I work with, like I would say like part of it is also in my responsibility. It's not that straightforward, but again, like you have a cybersecurity team and you are also in charge of asking those questions like, are you certified? Where's my data hosted? Do you use the LM? Like where is the data like hosted? Do you use my data for training? If it goes down, like what happens? Like you can ask this question. And also when it comes to the survey design, which is a very specific one, but we've touched on with a survey URL, like to not send all your customers' data out in the open, like that's also your responsibility. So I think the first part is to be aware of it, and then the second part is making sure you have the right contracts, and then making sure that if something goes wrong, you have at least ways of being aware of this. And if you do this, you're in a pretty good shape. And again, if you want to improve, like you're going to have to use tools to have a greater impact, and probably not just one. And therefore, it's something to put in the process. And it's also a very interesting subject because when you want to build great customer experience, you need to build trust, and like that information security is part of this trust, right? So it's also part of the whole mission and journey.
Great. Well, thanks so much for summarizing. Thanks for listening as well. For anyone that's been listening, we've gone through a number of security risks for the CX professional when using a platform. And tune in for another episode where we'll go through a completely different topic for the CX professional. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Have a good one.